On today's show, I am joined by Glen Willis of ATL and 29 for part one of a two-part conversation here in late July, heading into August. All kinds of different things on the agenda. David Roddy, the Olympics, Summer League, and more. It is coming up right now.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1774 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening into Tuesday here in late July. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at the Gametime app. Download the Gametime app right now, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast, as I always would, to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, on Apple, on Overcast, anywhere you might find your podcast on the audio side. We're also on YouTube. Please like this episode as you're watching it, plus subscribing on that platform, enabling notifications so that you know when there is a new pod that drops on that service. And today's podcast will be myself and Glen Willis. It's going to be part one of two, and part two should also be available in your same podcast feed as soon as part one drops, basically right after that on audio side, and then also on YouTube shortly after part one premieres. We'll be talking about all kinds of different things on this podcast. David Roddy and the trade that happened over the weekend, a little bit of Tyus Jones, some Olympic talk with Dyson Daniels and Bogey, and then a Summer League wrap-up at the end of the show as well. Always fun to talk to Glenn about all kinds of things in Hawks world. We do have different things coming up later on this week. Bruno Fernando has a guarantee date that's coming up, so a little bit of a news initiator there. Later on, we're still going to be delivering 3 or 4 episodes every single week, all summer long into September, into training camp, and then we'll be wrapping back up to 5 or so per week after that. So anyway, all that said, we'll dive in right now with part one with myself and Glen Willis. I am joined once again by a good friend of the podcast, Glen Willis of ATL and 29 fame. Glen, how are you as the calendar gets ready to turn to August?
I'm good. Yeah, I thought this would be a quiet period, but there's a little minor news there. So nice to have a little something to kind of prime the content, and things like that. So, but you got to think the next few weeks will be a break, Olympics, and especially with Dyson Daniels kind of getting to watch him play, and Bogey's always Bogey and stuff. So it's nice to have some source of content in this normally kind of dead period in the NBA. But you've been traveling, and I got 2 weeks of traveling coming up starting next week myself. So good to connect while we can.
Yeah, I have been home very little, and people that watch the podcast on YouTube have noticed that. I'm sure I've been in some odd places with some bad lighting and all kinds of things, and but yeah, kind of unexpected. I would hesitate to call either one of the podcasts I did over the weekend emergency podcasts, because they really weren't emergencies. But I was able to do podcasts, and one of them was about a trade that was a minor one that got announced today. It's now official as of Monday, and then there was this pseudo reporting I did the next day, which we'll come back to in a second. But let's start with the trade that happened. You alluded to it. It is a little bit of news. A lot of trades, it would be like an hour-long discussion. This is not going to be that. I can almost assure you, even with me and you, you and I could try to do it for an hour. We might succeed, but we won't. A pretty simple kind of a challenge trade is the way that I put it. It's like an old school, we think this guy's better than you think this guy is kind of trade. Also very much at the lower level, but if anybody missed it, I did a show about it, but it was the Hawks trading EJ Liddell, who they just acquired in the DeJounte Murray trade, as kind of a throw in there for David Roddy, a former first-round pick of Memphis, who's been in Phoenix since the middle of last season. I mentioned a second ago, again, this deal is now official. What do you think about David Roddy? Because he and Liddell are not that different, but there's some similarities. They're undersized, but they're also Roddy's kind of more of a wing. Anyway, what do you make of these guys, and what that deal actually says? Because it's prime for over-analysis, because it's the only thing happening right now.
It is. And I mean, it's funny. The first thing I put on Twitter was, I have no idea what to make of this trade. I really don't have any analysis here.
Yeah.
I mean, you with these kinds of trades, there's two things. You try not to overthink it, because there's no reason to really overthink it. Then you also try to take kind of a broad view, because that's usually what a trade of this size and scale is sort of the broad view. And the thing that kind of comes to mind for me is, David Roddy played in Memphis. Taylor Jenkins runs an offense based on pace, spacing, ball movement. I went back and looked at his assist to turnover numbers, and for a guy who's like a low usage role guy on offense, to have a pretty good positive lean towards assists instead of turnovers, so And for a guy who's 6'4", and I mean, how do you quantify his size? His height doesn't give you any sort of indication of kind of what size he brings and physicality he can bring defensively. But the key there is that, for me, I just think the time he spent playing for Taylor Jenkins and Quinn and Taylor are both in the Bud Tree and both, shared a season in Atlanta. And so I just think it's a little bit of a known quantity, a guy who has been in an offensive system, knows what the expectations are, knows what his role would be, in a way that, EJ Liddell had not been kind of exposed to that type of kind of systematic kind of approach. And in that sense, I think it kind of just makes some sense that he might be a little bit more ready to be kind of dropped in. I mean, you wonder how much he would actually play this year. He's on a guaranteed contract, so you got to think that he's in the plan in some form or fashion. But I think he's a guy that they think probably is more ready to kind of go on the court when needed and give them the things that they would ask for a guy like him, where EJ Liddell really doesn't have that background with this type of a system and approach that Roddy already had playing at Memphis for Taylor Jenkins.
Yeah, I mentioned the challenge trade idea. It's also, respect to Liddell, he was a throw-in that trade. They had to make the money work. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but the Hawks were not so much proactively seeking out EJ Liddell. He had to be him and Cody Zeller had to be there to make the money work. Whereas this is a proactive move where the Hawks seem to think something of David Roddy. Basically, we don't know how much they love him. All we know is that they think more of him than they did of Liddell. That's kind of all we know for sure at this moment. In fact, I know Lauren Williams reported it, and I heard the same thing after she said it. Like, the Hawks basically just think of Roddy as a more logical fit for their roster. It's as simple as that. It wasn't like a huge thing. And, you mentioned the body types has been a talking point. I led with 6'4", and people are like, wait, 6'4"? It's like, well, yeah, he also is listed at 255. He's a very bulky individual. Also, I think I forgot to mention this on the reaction podcast I did, but he measured with a 6'11" wingspan at the combine. So he's very long for as much as you might think of this guy as being kind of short and how thick he is. He's got long arms, and the book on him, he's not a great athlete, so to speak. At the same time, he processes pretty well from what I've seen. I watched a little bit more film of him. I watched him a lot as a prospect going back to his college tape. Haven't watched a ton of him in the NBA. He hasn't played that much in the NBA, but when he has played, I like what I've seen processing wise. The big question is, can he be efficient at all as a shooter / scorer? Because he's not been so far in his career. He's been struggling to make shots, and he kind of has to make shots. That's one of the things we don't really know where that's going to fall. I know you don't cover them you don't cover Memphis or Phoenix like you do Atlanta. Same for me. The defense is a question because I know our good pal Tyus Jones and I talked about this kind of online, kind of offline even. Liddell is like a pure big defensively, despite being 6'6". It's kind of funny to say that out loud, but EJ Liddell is a rim protector defensively, good instinct, but that is more of a big, let's just say. It seems like David Roddy is more of a wing, more of a forward, more of a perimeter guy naturally, despite the big body Roddy nickname. Does that say anything to you? The Hawks you can never have too many wing size players. But what is that? Do you care about that as far as the positional thing, or is it more of a consequence of they just seem like one guy better than the other guy?
Yeah, I think he has a little bit more versatility because of the kind of size he has. I think he can go in and kind of take up more space in the interior. Let's say, for example, as low man, he comes in, he's got he's just going to consume more space than EJ Liddell. And EJ is a pretty big guy too, but Roddy just consumes so much more space. And having the low center of gravity helps you as a rebounder. If you're not tall, right, and 6'8", 6'9", what have you, being able to kind of go in and get under people and kind of get your base established as a rebounder helps a lot too. So for me, I just think you look at who they're going to have presumably defending on ball. If that starts with Dyson Daniels, you think Kobe, if healthy, is going to have some sort of role there. Don't know how big at this point in time. V got some run in that role last year. Don't know if Hunter's going to be on the roster for sure. Seems a little more likely each week that's how it's going to shake out. But just to have so if you look at those smaller guys, like Kobe's a little thinner and Veet's pretty thin, having a guy that can go take on a big wing, even on second unit role or something like that, just makes a lot of sense. And he's just a little bit more polished as a defender. He's a little older than EJ too. a little bit more experience, a little bit more time in the league. EJ lost the whole season, as we know, with that injury that he, had in summer league. So I just think Roddy's just like I hate to kind of bring it back to. I just think Roddy's a little bit more ready, maybe more than a little bit more ready to contribute right now. And like I said, I think the contrast of how big and physically he plays to the other point of attack defenders that are kind of on the roster right now is just different. I think the other part too is if you do roll into the season with Hunter's historically missed a lot of time. And not having depth behind Jalen and Hunter last year when they were both out with injuries, it was brutal at the 4, and then they eventually lost Sadiq as well. And so, last year they had nothing to turn to at all. They were playing, you and I talked about, they were playing Wes Matthews at the 4 in some cases and things like that. And so to have some depth there just helps in my mind. And he's just a competent professional player. The shooting makes it a little bit harder to kind of see how he's going to fit on offense. Can they teach him to shoot at this point in time? It's hard to say, but but I think mostly it's the defensive depth that they're looking for with this transaction.
Today's show is brought to you by Gametime, and Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball to help you get the best ball tickets that you're looking for faster and easier, in addition to basketball tickets, as well as all kinds of different stuff, Braves, Falcons, shows, concerts across the board. They have last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from receipts, and the lowest possible price guarantee. And that makes Gametime a fantastic option. It makes things easy for you across the board. I've been using the app forever at this point in time. It's come in handy for me for not only sports, but also, again, concerts and comedy, theater, and more. Save big when buying last-minute tickets for all kinds of different events. They have flash deals. Actually save big money there, and also save even more when you choose a section in a venue and then allow them to choose the seats for you within that section. And also this awesome feature that I really enjoy where you can toggle to show the total up front with no surprise fees. When you get to the end of your process and the checkout screen, you will know exactly what you're going to pay at that point in time. Also get a panoramic view of the seats in the app before you buy them. You actually know exactly what you're looking for when you get into that venue, and you're getting the lowest possible price guaranteed with the folks at Gametime. Take all of the guesswork out of buying tickets with the Gametime app. Download the Gametime app right now, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. One more time, download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. I would say in general, Roddy's a little bit more malleable for what they could use. Like Liddell, again, I think Liddell is a perfectly fine, depth guy on a roster, but I think even more as a big. They have a lot of bigs famously on this roster. They have a lot of centers, and they got Mo Gay, who's they view as more of a 4, but has center size, and Jalen, et cetera. Like I think there's just a little bit more. How do I frame it? I think a little bit more natural scalability in David Roddy if the offense comes around. Because while I liked him as a prospect, Glenn's cat is in the frame, which is very funny to me. Hi, cat. No, I'm kidding. But it's one of those things where I think that Roddy's defense is not incredible, but I think it can work and be helpful as a wing body. And if he shoots it enough, he's an NBA player. If he doesn't, he's not. I don't think if he shoots the way he has the last 2 years, which is a 50% true shooting, not making threes, it gets kind of dicey. I've asked people that cover the Grizzlies and the Suns, who I trust, that have watched him a lot more than me. And they're basically like, the shot's got to go in. And if it doesn't go in, he's a fringe guy. And that's okay when you're trading EJ Liddell for him. This is not a huge investment they're making. And I don't know about how you feel about this, Glenn. We can move on. It seems to me that I would still slot him along with Cody Zeller as the last guys on the bench right now. I think Roddy might play some if you need if you need a body, but let's just say everybody's healthy. I think he and Zeller are kind of 14 and 15. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's kind of my guess at this moment in time, just not knowing anything yet. It's still July as we're talking, but that's just kind of the way at least I would stack it up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the center position is really unknown right now because they just have too many guys, so too many bodies there. I think with Roddy, I don't think it's too many guys. There's still a roster count problem right now. They're over right where they need to be when they cut down to 15 the day before the season starts or whenever it is, right? And so, but I do think Roddy is defensive depth. I think it's exactly what he is, and we talk about it all the time. Whether he's he's a career 30% or so guy. Even if you're a 33% guy, the rule of thumb that guys like Quinn ask for is you shoot it. If you're open, you shoot it. If you're open, you shoot it, right? And that a lot of it comes down to just the willingness to not really care if you miss the shot, but that that the thing you're asked to do if the other team is ignoring you, you're wide open, is that you put that shot up, right? And so that's kind of what it's going to come down to. I just think he's a guy who's professional and will not be kind of spooked about having to do things that aren't necessarily his strength, in that sense. It's just like sort of, part of, I think, Veet's progression last year was just a willingness to shoot the basketball, even though historically he had been a good shooter. And it's kind of funny how sometimes if you just get into that mode, a little bit of confidence comes with that aggressiveness. Results certainly help, in that sense. Positive feedback loops help and things like that. So, but yeah, like I said, I just think he's a competent guy you throw out. He's not going to embarrass you. He's going to do the basics. He's going to do the fundamental things. He's going to understand the system. He's going to understand what's just asked of him, and not need to be kind of coached through what he has to do. He knows what in a situation where he's playing, whether it's an injury or someone's in foul trouble, kind of a little team's in a pinch situation, whatever, he goes in there. I just think you don't have to really worry about him doing the basics. And that's what you look for in spots 13, 14, 15 on your roster to me.
Yeah, I think I would have done the trade. The only, Roddy makes a little bit more money, but they're still under the tax when they get there. I'll cover that on the Super Emergency show. But I think that there is a clearer path to Roddy helping the Hawks than Liddell, which is kind of all that matters when it comes to a 1-for-1. So it sounds like you agree.
Yeah. And the other part for EJ is, who knows if this is a factor, but EJ needs to go somewhere he can play. Where he is in his career, he needs to go somewhere he can play. And sometimes organizations, if they just know like that's not going to happen here, the right thing to do is to help him move on and hopefully find a place where he can play. Roddy's at a point where he doesn't necessarily have to play. I think Roddy is mostly what he's going to be, but EJ needs developmental experience, and if he wasn't going to get that in Atlanta, and it seems like he wasn't going to, then a part of that could have been too, let's help EJ, and I mean, organizations try to build goodwill with agents and representatives and things like that. It's not always the biggest factor, but it is sometimes a factor in the way they're thinking and to kind of partner in that way. And so from on the EJ side of things, who knows where he's going to end up being rostered this year, but I hope he gets an opportunity to have some developmental minutes and some semi-regular play time to help him kind of come along. Because I think he could be a good NBA player in the right developmental kind of context, going forward.
Yeah, I like him too. I think he can still make it too. But a good point there to kind of get him somewhere else where he can play more minutes. Because I don't think in Atlanta, I think it would have taken several injuries to get EJ Liddell regular playing time in Atlanta. So there you go. We already talked about Summer League a little bit later in this conversation, but before we get to that, a couple other smaller things. I did my second semi-emergency podcast was some reporting I did about Tyus Jones, who did not sign with the Hawks, but ended up going to Phoenix. But I reported, and I think John Gabadoro did, somebody else did, like it kind of made the rounds a little bit, that the Hawks were in on Tyus Jones to some degree. And my opinion's on that podcast, but I want to know what you thought about that, because a lot of the reaction was mixed that I heard. I was kind of confused by it because I was like, guys, if you get a good player for the price of simple money, like why wouldn't you make the call on Tyus Jones? I thought it was pretty logical why the Hawks would have called Tyus Jones once the price dropped. But what did you think of that kind of rumbling that was out there about maybe the Hawks pursuing him?
Well, I mean, it's one of those situations. I know their big reaction was people who are big fans of Kobe, that I am, are like,
me too.
Wait a minute. Like, how does this impact his playing time? But, Tyus Jones is a level of player that if you have an opportunity to go get him, especially at an affordable price, you have to explore that. And for the Hawks, they don't really have anyone set up to play behind Trey right now. I mean, I know one thought process might be give Kobe 14 minutes a game, run in the second unit offense, whatever that number is. You hope he could also play with Trey a little bit as the season kind of goes along too. But he's been banged up basically since he's been drafted. And so I think for me, trying to project Kobe playing 1,200 minutes next year or whatever, I think you have to be prepared for that might maybe not being a fully reliable scenario. I think you have to see him get through a season healthy before you can kind of plan, to that expectation. And on top of that, Tyus Jones is, has been probably the best backup point guard in the league for a number of years now. And so you have a chance to kind of go get him at that level, then I think you have to explore that. he would have helped the Hawks a ton. He's a pro. It's one of those things like we've watched, the whole time Trey's been here. When he's gone to the bench, basically the offense has not done well. And Tyus Jones is not Trae Young. No one's Trae Young, really, except for Trae Young. But he's a guy who can kind of maintain what you're trying to do when Trae is off the floor in terms of running the offense, creating, initiating, being a responsible ball handler, all that sort of stuff. So it made perfect sense that they looked into that. It doesn't surprise me that Tyus wanted to go play somewhere else where he has a bigger role. I mean, it's a no-brainer, for him. To me, it's kind of surprising he hasn't been kind of a fully accepted starting point guard in the league. He's good enough to do that, It's just a little bit weird to me. He hasn't had that opportunity. So for me, I think when value opportunities like that come along and it's such a good player, you got to go check it out. And the Hawks were right to do that, I think.
Yeah, and that's, I kept saying a few things probably too often. I listened to that podcast again. I was repeating myself because I don't have a ton of notes in front of me, but it was a situation where the price falls and you got a good player, and the Hawks the Hawks do have this tax avoidance thing, which they've, no matter what they say, they have been avoiding the tax on purpose the last few years, and they still are right now. But they had a mechanism to pay him more than the Suns could have paid him. And I think you probably agree with this, but like if he was going to be signing for what he signed for last year, 2 years ago, $15 million a year, the Hawks weren't going to be in the mix on that. That was not going to be where they were. But when a guy that's probably worth $15 million a year, $18 million a year is available for $5 million a year at a position where you could use a player, like, come on. I think it's why wouldn't you do this? And you and I both love Kobe. This is like a Kobe appreciation duo, you and I. But, and I mentioned this on the show earlier this week, but like, yes, right now on the roster, he's the backup point guard, and the Hawks like him a lot. Quinn likes Kobe a lot, but he is thoroughly unproven as an NBA point guard, like thoroughly, completely. I mean, even last year when he came up and played after he got healthy, he was playing next to Trae or DeJounte almost all the time. He wasn't running the show. And when he did, it was in very small stints at the very end of the year, all the injuries and stuff. So I understand the Hawks maybe wanting to go with Kobe at number 2, backup point guard. But, I think you and I talked about this. I know our mutual friend Andrew Kelly and I talked about this. Like, the Hawks were tied to, like, Colin Gillespie earlier in the summer. Like, Jordan McLaughlin was a natural name. Like, those guys are not available anymore, but, like, boring third point guard types just for another guy to get. And, yeah, Keaton Wallace, they now have. Keaton Wallace is different than those guys, but certainly can play point guard. But I think the Hawks would still, in my opinion, if there was a guy available, be wise to make a call on another point guard. And it doesn't mean they have to play that guy over Kobe. The quote-unquote problem with Tyus Jones is that he's too good not to play. So I do understand that reaction. It's like, okay, if you get Tyus Jones, Kobe may not play at all. And that I guess that's more of a question. I understand that reaction, but he's the only guy like that was available anyway. So I would still probably try to add somebody. And honestly, I still think if they had signed Tyus Jones, they probably would have traded him in February. You know what I mean? Yeah, just to like, you trade him, you get, hey, thanks for your service, Tyus. We're going to send you where you want to go and shake your hand and move on. But anyway, it didn't happen. I got a lot of people's like, why is this a story? I'm like, well, it's a story because of what it tells you about the Hawks. Even though they didn't sign him, they wanted to. And it's just an interesting thing that I wasn't necessarily expecting to hear, like, at all. But the price fell so far. I mean, man, the fact that Tyus Jones signed for the minimum on like July 26th is pretty wild, actually.
The reality is as encouraging as the stretch of play we saw Kobe have last year were, this year I expect this year to be still largely a developmental season for him, right? Maybe it'll be the first half of the season is more developmental and he'll kind of settle in. The second half he'll look more like a steady actual NBA player. And he needs to play. Kobe needs to play, right? But it's like kind of famous conundrum. The Hawks need to pursue winning from the very start of the season, and they have young guys that need to play, right? And in that sense, that's Quinn's job to kind of figure out kind of that balancing act where you kind of make it happen. Yeah. And so for me, it's like a part of me is like, I'm glad Kobe seemingly will get to play, but at the same time, it's going to be up and down for, I would think, let's call it the first half of the season. It's going to be up, and it is for any point guard having their first regular, consistent exposure to rotational minutes. it's up. It's going to be up and down. And to have another competent guy available, even if it's a guy, I always joke with you about, a guy like Reggie Jackson that, can kind of, Reggie's probably still expects to play more than he would have in a role like that,
Yeah.
But is there a point guard who's, 33, 34 years old, will not play for a month or whatever it is and kind of be able to kind of go in if Kobe's really, struggling in a close game and kind of go, take the minutes in the second half or whatever. I'm with you. Like, as much as I love Keaton can't run your offense in a real game, right?
I don't think so either. And that's the thing. Like, I got a lot of responses, and also just to say this out loud, there's also the people grouping Dyson Daniels in there, and we'll talk about him in a second for the Olympics. But I am a unabashed Dyson Daniels guy. I was excited about the trade in large part because of him. He isn't a point guard, Glenn. I mean, at least not for me.
He's not a point guard. He's a secondary. I mean, he's a secondary creator. He's only 21, so when he's 23, he might be something different than he is right now.
Sure,
there might be a little bit more, right? But I mean, New Orleans famously, kind of played without a point guard, and Willie Green didn't turn to Dyson Daniels and say, "Here's 15 minutes a game where I want you to play." That didn't happen.
Yeah, he played there a little bit, but it was more like when he was the point guard, they were playing through Zion. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like the point Zion thing happened for a while. Let's just say, in this scenario for the Hawks, they don't have a guy to run the offense through with Trey off the court. You know what I mean? Like it'd be different if you had, let's say you had pick, I guess maybe you could say Jalen. I don't think Jalen's ready for that either, to be like the initiator on the court. But there are teams that can play these no point guard lineups, and Dyson can defend point guards all day long. But they don't have the initiation elsewhere, I don't think, to make that work as a primary look.
Yeah, that's where if Kobe's going to be your backup point guard the whole season, he needs to be on the court with Bogey. Bogey will help him a ton.
Oh yeah.
And so that seems like a requirement. It's like it feels like every minute Kobe's at the one, Bogey's got to be out there with him. It feels that way. Veit will help. But playing with Veit will help too. I mean, Veit can move the ball and help facilitate. And Veit has some point guardish qualities to him too. That might be helpful. So yeah.
No, I was going to say the same thing. Like maybe there's a scenario where if they don't bring in, and look, Reggie Jackson's a guy that I don't love, but it's a good idea because but no, I would actually not be. I wouldn't mind that now. Because Reggie's at the point where, like, if you got to put him on the shelf, you put him on the shelf. That's fine. But, yeah, and look, I'm not saying that it's like this 5-alarm fire that the Hawks have to sign someone between now and the season, because they're not trying to win the championship this year. As much as that would be fun, they're not quite there, and development does matter. But you laid it out. They're still going to try to win, and there's a scenario where they might need another guy to kind of be a steady hand behind Kobe. And look, maybe Kobe's ready. Maybe we get to October and you and I look at Kobe's ready. Don't worry about it. We're fine. But we don't know that now, especially after no summer league. And I don't care about the missed games in summer league doesn't actually matter to me. But another injury, another couple of weeks where he's not playing basketball, it didn't help, if nothing else. So we're off the rails. But it's just it created this whole conversation about Kobe where like I was being framed as like super anti-Kobe. I'm like, no, I'm actually quite high on Kobe. Maybe not as high as you, Glenn, because I know you love Kobe, but I like Kobe a lot. And it wasn't about being negative on Kobe. It's just that you might want another option. That's all.
Yeah, I think the ideal is if you can't get a Tyus Jones, Kobe's your backup point guard. You have a third guy, like I said, who's, I don't know, Corey Joseph, just someone who's just a pro. You can keep on ice and break him out if you need to. Corey Joseph's, pretty limited now, so he's just the guy who came.
Well, one of those guys. I mean, pick a random veteran backup, boring point. Raul Neto, like one of those guys who you just don't have to worry about.
Yeah. There you go. So, but I mean, they'd have to get rid of. They're going to have to get rid of somebody on the roster to make room for that.
Yeah,
person.
that is the thing. I mean, and this is it's correct because every time I bring it up, like, all right. I think the Hawks probably need another guard and another shooter on the forward line somewhere. And the appropriate reaction is, well, they have a full roster, and that's correct. I'm not telling you that they can do anything. And that's, we will not do the entire breakdown of the roster right now. But Bruno's guarantee date is Thursday. That's step one. I think there's a decent chance Bruno gets waived on Thursday. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it could happen between now and then. But even then, even if they waive Bruno, they're 15. Still, they have a full roster. TBD on Larry Nance, TBD on Capella, all that stuff. we'll save it. But yeah, roster challenges to be sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's more.
We'll see on Bruno. The fact that they keep extending feels like they want to work together and
they don't want to cut him. It's just that at some point, if they don't make another, this is what I've said, I'll say it again. If they don't make another move with the roster by Thursday, you can't really keep him with where they are, I don't think. Yeah. Given that they have the tax issues, they have the roster issues, he'd be the 16th guy on a guaranteed contract. And, at some point you got to get to 15. I'm not saying they can't. One thing that I actually should correct is they're allowed to guarantee him. You're allowed to have 16 guys that are guaranteed contracts in August. That's totally fine. But the problem is you have to then do something with a guaranteed contract between now and opening night. And that's not impossible to do. But what I would say is if Bruno had not agreed to push the date back the last time, they would have cut him. That's kind of that's usually how the give and take works. It's like when you work together to move a guarantee date back, it's the team saying, "Hey, we're about to cut you unless you agree to move this date back." That's basically what happens when I'm not saying that definitely happened, but that's the logical extension there, and we'll see. But hey, we like Bruno on this podcast. All right, that is all for part 1 of this 2-part episode. So please stay tuned for part 2. It should be available in this same podcast feed you're listening to or watching on YouTube. Please go ahead and subscribe to this podcast on Apple, on Spotify, on Overcast, etc. on the audio side. And again, if you're watching on YouTube, please like this episode and then find your way over to the second part of this conversation, plus subscribe and enable notifications so you can find the podcast anytime it drops on that platform. Follow the show on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there at BT Rowland. Follow my written work and some extra stuff at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I appreciate everyone for listening to the show. As always, we'll see you with part 2 coming up right now. It should be available in this same feed right now. Please stay tuned for that, and we'll see you all next time.